The flesh decays, the mind falters, the heart betrays, but iron endures. Ancient Medusan proverb I, Gas Havelock, have chronicled 1,000 years of war. I have inked the triumphs of heroes, the deaths of kings, and the rise of empires whose banners are now dust in the wind. Yet never have I been so burdened as I am now, tasked with laying bare the tale of the Iron Hands and their lost father. For this is not a tale of conquest alone, nor of betrayal alone. It is a tragedy of iron and flesh, of brothers sundered, of loyalty tested in the crucible of the heresy. The Iron Hands were not born in warmth or mercy. They were forged, hammered in the roaring furnaces of Medusa, an unforgiving world of blackened ice, boiling rivers, and stone cracked open by volcanic fire. The planet was a paradox, its surface locked in permafrost, its veins alive with molten fury. On Medusa there was no soft soil to till, no gentle seasons to ease the burdens of life. Only the strong endured. The weak were swallowed by the glaciers or burned in the lava flows. It was here that the Iron Hands found their truth, that flesh is frail, but steel is eternal. In the earliest days after the Emperor found him, Ferrus Manus shaped his legion in Medusa's image. They had been warriors before, the XDH Legion, bred for war in the gene laboratories of Terra, but under his hand, they became something else entirely. From him, they learned that a warrior's first duty was to endure, that no wound was an excuse to falter, no hardship cause for retreat. Injury was weakness. Weakness was an affront to the Emperor. Augmentation, replacing what the flesh could not preserve, was not just necessity, but virtue. Bionic limbs, reinforced spines, steel-plated skulls, these were badges of honor among the Iron Hands, proof that the bearer had overcome the treachery of mortal flesh. The Medusan tribes who joined the Legion were already half-machine by the time they swore the oath. Those who weren't became so. And in this, they saw themselves as the Emperor's truest servants, stripped of softness, stripped of excess, stripped of everything but the will to conquer. Ferrus Manus ruled this brotherhood as both smith and warrior. His very name came from the hands he bore, metallic, silvered from birth, stronger than any forged weapon. Yet those hands were not his true strength. His true strength was the unshakable belief that the galaxy could, and must, be remade through discipline, labor, and the purging of weakness. He spoke little, laughed less, but when he gave his word, it was an oath of iron. Before the Emperor's arrival, Ferrus Manus had been the master of Medusa's fractured tribes. He had risen not through lineage, for on Medusa, bloodlines were frozen beneath the glaciers, but through conquest. As a youth, he had crossed molten rivers barefoot, hunted the great ice serpents in the north, and wrestled the steel-shelled dreadworms that tunneled beneath the Black Mountains. Legends tell of the day he fought the great worm of the northern ice, a creature older than human memory, whose hide was plated in scales harder than any forged steel. For days they battled across the glacier fields, the worm's breath a storm of frost, Ferrus's rage a fire that would not be quenched. When he finally slew it, he did not take its head as a trophy. Instead, he plunged his arms into its molten heart, letting the silver quickmetal bind to his flesh forever. The man who emerged from that battle was no longer merely human. He was a weapon, and he would make his world into one as well. When the Emperor came, he found not a supplicant child, but a ruler already tempered by war. There was no kneeling, no surrender, only recognition. The Emperor offered him command of the XDH Legion, and Ferrus accepted without hesitation, for here was a master who shared his vision. That weakness must be purged, and strength was the only true currency in the stars. The merging of Legion and Primarch was not seamless. Terran-born veterans found their new lord austere, even cold, but respect followed swiftly. Ferrus was no distant figurehead. He fought in the vanguard, his silver hands breaking the necks of war beasts, his hammer strokes shattering fortress gates. Those who doubted his creed did not doubt for long. Under his rule, the Iron Hands waged the Great Crusade with relentless precision. Planets were brought to compliance not through negotiation, but through the hammering persistence of a forge smith. They broke their enemies, reforged them under the Imperium's anvil, and left only iron where flesh had once faltered. Flesh is weak. The phrase was more than doctrine, it was an article of faith. The Iron Hands saw in their Primarch the living proof that mortality could be transcended. Bionics were not repairs, but improvements. A warrior who lost an arm in battle was not diminished. He was made stronger when that arm was replaced with steel. And yet, there was a paradox here, one I have come to understand only in the long years since the heresy. For while the Iron Hands sought to strip away their humanity to escape weakness, they could never truly sever it. They still felt pride and loyalty and love for their Primarch, emotions no machine could entirely replicate. This was their hidden flaw, the thing no layer of steel could shield. Of all his brothers, there was one Ferrus Manus cherished above the rest, Fulgrim, the Phoenician, lord of the Emperor's children. Where Ferrus was a storm-forged hammer, Fulgrim was a blade honed to impossible sharpness. They were opposites in so many ways: Ferrus, grim and unyielding; Fulgrim, brilliant and resplendent. And yet they were bound by mutual respect. They had fought side by side on campaigns where worlds burned beneath their combined fury. Ferrus had crafted weapons for Fulgrim's hand. Fulgrim had stood beside Ferrus against foes that would have shattered lesser men. There is an account from the siege of the Tarsine vaults, where the two led the charge together. Fulgrim's armor shone like polished pearl, Ferrus's black plate scorched and battered. When the gates fell, they clasped arms in the ruins, two victors laughing amid the ash. Those moments mattered. In them, Ferrus saw not just a brother, but an equal, a man he could trust in a galaxy where trust was a rare metal indeed. And yet, even in those early days, the first hairline cracks could be seen by one who looked closely. Fulgrim's hunger for perfection was different from Ferrus's pursuit of strength. The Phoenician sought beauty, artistry, refinement, even in war. Ferrus cared nothing for such things. To him, war was a forge and soldiers were the iron within it. It was in the quiet hours when the forge fires dimmed and campaigns were won that Ferrus would feel it, a subtle distance growing. Nothing overt, nothing hostile, but like the slow spread of frost beneath a door, it was there. I write these words knowing the ending, and that knowledge bleeds into every line. I see their bond now as a masterpiece left unfinished, the final strokes never laid because the canvas was torn in two. But in those days, neither Ferrus nor Fulgrim could have imagined how deep the fissure would run. They were brothers. They believed in the same emperor, fought for the same dream. And perhaps that was why the betrayal, when it came, would cut so deep. For steel may endure longer than flesh, but even iron can be broken. I have always believed that history remembers not the day a tree began to die, but the moment it fell. We record the crash and the echo. We forget the slow rot beneath the bark, the fungus quietly spreading out of sight. For those who lived beside Ferrus Manus, the rot, if rot it be, made itself known long before the final hour. Call it pride, call it vanity, call it a change of spirit. Whatever name we give it, that change was not sudden. It was patient. It grew in small, almost imperceptible ways until it split brother from brother. In the years after the Great Crusade moved beyond the inner systems, the Legion's shape began to reveal fissures. Where once their doctrine had been a single, glinting blade, the imperious logic of Ferrus, it now took on the form of two instruments playing a similar tune but not the same song. Ferrus struck with measured blows, Fulgrim composed with filigreed flourishes. The two could still create masterpieces in war, but their hands were no longer steady together. The early campaigns after the Unification Wars were a study in complementary genius. On many worlds, Ferrus's straightforward assaults rolled like glaciers across enemy lines. He taught his captains to think in the weight of things. Logistics, reinforcement cycles, the angle of siege engines. The Iron Hands took what others would defend and made it their own by patient, cold pressure. It was an artless sort of poetry, but poetry nonetheless. Fulgrim's methods, by contrast, were theatrical and precise. He prized timing, the angle at which a blade caught light, and the moral effect of a victory on those who beheld it. He refined an assault into a demonstration, a lesson in how war could be beautiful. When the Emperor permitted the two to operate together, Ferrus holding the center while Fulgrim executed the elegiac stroke, victories were complete and absolute. They were victories the galaxy remembered. But victory breeds nuance. In victory's glow, men notice themselves. For Fulgrim, applause was a mirror. He saw himself and he liked the reflection. It is not a crime to appreciate beauty. It becomes one when that appreciation begins to warp judgment. Where Ferrus measured force to minimize unnecessary loss and to ensure the continued functioning of the Legion, Fulgrim sometimes measured it by the splendor of the result. On worlds where the populace could be spared, Fulgrim favored intricate operations that left relics, symbols, behind. On worlds that offered nothing but blood, he still preferred the signature of triumph, a sculpted ruin over a quick, brutal subjugation. This shift was subtle. At first, Ferrus noticed only an added flourish in battle plans, an ornamental phalanx here, an elaborate diversion there. He admired the result as a craftsman admires fine finish on a blade. But as campaigns continued, the ornament grew thicker. Men were asked to risk for shows as much as for strategic gain. Machines that could have been used for salvage were instead recalibrated for spectacle. Ferrus, practical to the bone, frowned and adjusted. He believed in efficiency. Fulgrim increasingly believed in expression. The fall does not arrive on a single day. It arrives in choices. The decision to spare a city in order to erect a monument, the order to attempt a complex encirclement instead of a direct crushing blow, the insistence that a unit hold a perilous vantage solely because its position would be noted and celebrated in dispatches. For every such choice there is a moral arithmetic, lives spent now versus some abstract future reputation. There was the campaign on Jala's Prime, a world of glass cities perched upon basalt columns, steam rising from deep fissures like the breath of a sleeping god. The planet's ruling cabal had wrapped themselves in ritual and art. They believed their ornate defenses sacred. Ferrus saw them for what they were, fortifications built to stall, not to fight, and proposed a direct, patient attrition that would spare the civilian cores and break the cabal's will by isolating its supply lines. Fulgrim proposed instead an invasion of precision, a series of small, ceremonial strikes designed to humiliate the rulers and force capitulation through spectacle. The idea thrilled the Emperor's children, who relished turning conquest into theater. The plan was carried out. Fulgrim's diversions were exquisite, his chosen strike teams moving like dancers through the enemy's defenses, carving sigils of dominance in the wake of their blades. By the time Ferrus's attrition had ground the outer forces to dust, Fulgrim had taken the citadel in a single, glittering assault. The palace fell, its marble bloodied, and the Phoenicians stood amidst the ruin, blood-slick and immaculate, to accept surrender while musicians Fulgrim had brought with him played a dirge to the dying. The scene should have felt triumphant, and it did, at first. But in the aftermath, the price was counted. A supply convoy left vulnerable for the sake of a tableau was lost to raiders. A salvage yard's delicate equipment, useful for mending the Legion's armor and augmentations, was consumed because it made a better backdrop for photographs and plaques. Lives that could have been preserved were risked for the sake of image. Ferrus's captains, disciplined instruments of war, concealed their unease. They had been raised to obey, but even obedience can breed whispers. Whispers grew teeth. In council chambers, where tactics and engineering met, Ferrus would argue for pragmatism and redundancy. Fulgrim would reply with arguments about morale, the power of wonder, the long-term influence of legend. To Ferrus, the future was a ledger, outcomes measured and accounted for. To Fulgrim, it was a stage, every victory an act that would sing for generations. The Emperor listened, and the councils chose both masters. Where Ferrus pushed for fewer losses and more efficiency, Fulgrim's hand coaxed the spectacular from it. The Iron Hands and the Emperor's children remained allies, and yet a new friction hummed in the alloys. At first, Ferrus's concern was technical. He feared that Fulgrim's penchant for complexity, tactics that required precise timing, a perfect execution to avoid disaster, would elevate risk without proportionate gain. He took to regrading deployments, adjusting the weights of contingencies, insisting on backup detachments and measured pauses. Fulgrim chafed, but he did not outwardly mock. Only later, when the casualties mounted in theaters where a single misstep turned grandeur into ruin, did Ferrus sense something else in his brother's eyes: impatience. The Phoenician would not be denied his scenic vision. The first time Ferrus confronted Fulgrim as an equal, without honorific diversion and without the crowd, was in the shadow of a burning aerospire on a world called Scythe. They had broken the city's outer defenses. The enemy had retreated behind a maze of galleries and bridges, clinging to vantage points that favored smaller, more intricate tactics. Ferrus suggested consolidation of forces and methodical clearance. Fulgrim proposed a plunge, a precise strike by a hand-picked cohort that would force the defenders into a single flank. The cohort suffered more than expected. They achieved the point of fracture, but at a cost Ferrus had not authorized. They met in a ruined gallery where the air tasted of ash. Ferrus stood with one hand on his hammer's haft, the other rubbing the ragged edge of a study sketch taken from the field maps. Fulgrim's armor was still immaculate, the filigree catching the dim light like a mock sun. Both men were older than their faces suggested. Ferrus's voice was the rasp of an anvil. "You used my captains," Ferrus said. There was no heat in the accusation, only the flatness of someone cataloging a defect. Fulgrim looked at him for a long breath and then smiled as if congratulating a student. "They are not your property, Ferrus. They are the Emperor's soldiers. They are instruments to be played." "They are men," Ferrus replied, "and instruments require maintenance. You risked them for a flourish. The cost was unnecessary." Fulgrim's smile tightened. "There is no unnecessary act in war if the result changes history. We do not fight merely to survive. We fight to shape what remains." "You speak as if glory is a coin to be minted," Ferrus said. "There is no value in a victory that leaves you weaker to enjoy it." Fulgrim's eyes mirrored a world Ferrus did not want to visit, the world where victory must be admired, where every conquest had to be carved beautiful so that its lesson would last. "You would be satisfied with coffins then?" Fulgrim asked, strangely gentle, as if testing the temperature of his brother's heart. "You strip men of themselves only to make them efficient. There is nobility in craft, Ferrus. Beauty begets devotion." "Beauty does not mend bone," Ferrus said, "and devotion bought with spectacle is a brittle thing." They spoke then not as commander and subordinate but as brothers trading blows. There was love braided into the anger which made the strike deeper. Fulgrim accused Ferrus of being a dead thing already, an automaton who mistook preservation for perfection. Ferrus accused Fulgrim of vanity, of placing self above service. The words were barbed and precise. They found one another's hidden sores. The confrontation ended without rupture. The two returned to their commands. The war went on. But in private councils and over quiet meals, Ferrus began to catalog moments where Fulgrim's decisions diverged from the Legion's creed. He began to see patterns. An order that favored pageantry, a needless remake of a siege engine to look more elegant at the cost of time, a refusal to accept the simpler solution when the elegant one hung just out of reach of success. Each act by itself was rationalizable. Accumulate enough of them, and you produce a discernible drift away from the old ways. What gnawed at Ferrus was not merely the tactical difference but the moral one. The Iron Hands taught that augmentation and discipline were tools to preserve life and ensure effectiveness. Fulgrim seemed to treat these things as raw materials for his own refinement. To Ferrus, augmentation was to be deployed precisely, a prosthetic arm that returned a man to the field. To Fulgrim, it could be ornament, an enhancement made to delight as much as to purpose. This was not an argument about technology so much as the language of purpose. Ferrus saw war as a ledger and life as metrics. Fulgrim saw war as narrative and life as texture. Between ledger and narrative, a gulf opened, and neither brother made the bridge. The gulf widened further with the arrival of demonic whispers barely noticeable in the margins of triumph. I do not claim to discern the true origin of the corruption that would later devour Fulgrim. I record only that certain changes coexisted with his altered conduct. He kept company with artists, with philosophers new to the standards of the Crusade. He collected relics and music from worlds the Legion had subdued. He took pleasure in the refinement of his troops' forms, encouraging ornament that bordered on decadence. He seemed to find in these things a new axis of identity. Ferrus watched these tendencies with a haunted patience. He tried to speak, to guide, to remind. He summoned Fulgrim to private councils and spoke bluntly, emphasizing the need for reserve, for tactics that preserved the legionaries as instruments of war rather than objects for display. Fulgrim listened, perhaps with the courtesy due an elder, and then explained his vision, his tone framing his intent as a clarification rather than disagreement. He insisted that morale and legend were as important as supply lines. He suggested that the Emperor's children could bring a certain excellence to victory that would last beyond the battlefield. It was in the quiet after a fraying argument, beneath the hum of a warship's engines and the distant clang of maintenance crews, that Ferrus felt a deeper wound, an estrangement not just of tactics but of soul. Fulgrim had not answered as a brother would. He had answered as someone who had discovered a path he no longer trusted would be understood by Ferrus. The trust that had once allowed them to speak plainly now seemed to require explanation. Fulgrim had visions now. Ferrus had calculations. Both were acts of faith. The first direct, unsheathed refusal came at a strategy meeting where they argued over the deployment of force around a strategic nexus in the Thalos corridor. Ferrus proposed a slow, inexorable tightening of the enemy's supply belts. Fulgrim proposed a surgical strike intended to create a mythic image the sectors would carry forever. Ferrus asked him plainly whether he would sacrifice men for a tale, and Fulgrim answered with a clarity that chilled Ferrus more than any battlefield. "I would sacrifice myself for the tale if that is what it took." That sentence lingered afterward, like the ghost of a vow. Ferrus heard in it not the bravery of self-sacrifice, but the willingness to court risk for the single purpose of story. He understood then that Fulgrim had crossed a threshold. He had come to value the impression a deed made more than the deed's contribution to survival. Fulgrim's refined sensibility had become an engine that could consume prudence itself. Ferrus tried again. He tried to appeal not only to tactics but to brotherhood. He reminded Fulgrim of campaigns they had shared, of men who had fallen and voices that had asked only that the sacrifice be not in vain. He talked of duty and of the quiet work of rebuilding what war breaks. Fulgrim replied with poetry and with images of the future that glittered and seethed, as if the world itself should be made into art. The conversation ended in silence. There are silences between men that are not empty but full of the things left unsaid. Between Ferrus and Fulgrim, that silence was a wound that would not heal. Rumor, of course, began to gather its own momentum. Soldiers whispered that the Phoenician had been seen conversing with alien artisans, and that odd, foreign melodies had been introduced into certain banners. Some claimed he had taken to cultivating a circle of officers who mirrored his tastes, men as beautiful as they were deadly, while Ferrus favored those who were solid, dependable, unremarkable in the eyes of the galaxy. Those whispers cut both ways. Where Fulgrim's followers spoke of inspiration, Ferrus's men spoke of folly. I do not pretend that a single conversation would have sufficed to alter the course of fate. Men are not sculptures that can be restamped. But the mounting pattern of choices, the strained deliberations, and the bitter private exchanges created a bedrock of distrust. Ferrus, hardened by a lifetime of making choices by weight and measure, began to suspect that Fulgrim's path would lead not merely to disappointment, but to betrayal. He kept that fear close, tamped it down with duty and the rituals of command, but it lived in his chest like a cold ember. When he finally spoke to Fulgrim with the full throttle of his authority, less as friend and more as Primarch in duty, the moment crackled with the power of two suns colliding. They met alone in a corridor of a command ship, the metal around them humming, the void outside unblinking. Ferrus did not cloak his worry. His words were plain like a smith's tool. "You risk our men for your vanity," he said. Fulgrim's laughter was not loud. It was an inflection that glittered. "Vanity? You mistake artistry for vanity, Ferrus. I make the victories sing." "You make them a spectacle," Ferrus answered. "Spectacles have a cost." Fulgrim's smile thinned into a blade. "And pragmatism is a prison. You would have us mere machines of efficiency. I will not reduce beauty to utility." "Beauty cannot hold a wound," Ferrus said. "It cannot hold a man's life." Fulgrim's eyes flashed then, bright as a mirror struck. "You will never understand the artist's hand," he said, "and you will never understand mine. Then do not expect me to understand the consequences." The words were not a command, but an ultimatum wrapped in sorrow. Fulgrim stepped back as if wounded. "You would bind me to your ledger, brother. Is that the sum of your regard? My art is no crime." Ferrus's reply was the flattening iron of a conclusion. "When your art demands what we cannot spare, it is a breach of duty." Fulgrim's face, often so composed, broke into something like pity. "You are more machine than man when you speak like that," he murmured. "You will grind yourself down until all that remains is a perfect instrument, and you will think that perfection is salvation. And you," Ferrus said quietly, "will think yourself a god." They left the corridor without reconciliation. What might have been an argument between two passionate men hardened into a chasm. Fulgrim's conviction that he had found a new way to secure loyalty through awe, and Ferrus's conviction that the cost of such methods would eventually eat the Legion alive. A wedge, once driven, is difficult to extract without breaking the wood around it. In the months that followed, small incidents multiplied. Troops favored by Fulgrim were given ornate insignia and deployed to high-visibility actions. Ferrus's captains, the ones who had bled beside him for years, found promotions delayed for reasons thin as lacquer. Each act was explainable, each taken alone, but together they spoke of a pivot point. Fulgrim's circle grew. Ferrus's quiet counsel remained steady but thin. Yet beneath all this politicking lay the deeper fracture, a divergence in how the two understood honor. Ferrus measured it by the ability to endure and to return a man whole to his sons. Fulgrim measured it by the perfection of the deed and the immortality of its telling. Both were noble. Both were necessary to a degree. Honorable intent, however, does not inoculate a man against ruin when those intentions translate into contrary paths. It is easy to mark this time with bitterness, and to claim that envy or selfishness birthed betrayal. I find that too simple. This was a tragedy composed of two idealists who loved their art in different keys. One tuned his soldiers for survival, the other for beauty. The chords they struck together were then stretched apart until the sound itself snapped. And so the seeds of doubt ripened, silently, inexorably, into a suspicion that would one day require the pruning of blood. I am an old man with ink-stained fingers and a memory full of iron. I have labored over records where names are eroded and dates are burned into the margins, but even my hand trembles at writing what follows. There is a particular cruelty in betrayal. It is not merely the severing of trust, but the way it turns the familiar into a stranger, the beloved into an enemy. When the Phoenician's smile curdled into something other, Ferrus Manus felt it like a blade through bone. He had been warned by small things. He did not see the catastrophe coming until it stood naked before him, singing. At first the corruption was a whisper, a tincture of color in a world Ferrus had painted in iron and black. Fulgrim began to collect objects that had little use and great beauty, curious statuettes carved from the glass of dead suns. instruments that played notes which unsettled the mind, headdresses of unknown provenance. He welcomed foreign philosophers and artisans into his retinues, men and beings who spoke of refinement and perfection in tongues Ferrus did not trust. Where once Fulgrim had sought to sharpen his blade through discipline, he now seemed to seek a new edge in things that promised transcendence of a different order. Rumors shivered through the corridors of command like static. Men whispered of fevered nights where the Phoenician walked the decks with a blade at his hip, and eyes alight as if a candle burned within him. Servitors returned from errant worlds altered in ways small and strange. A design altered in a lock, a sigil inverted. Ships reported instruments that hummed at frequencies that made eyes water and dogs uneasy. These are the sorts of things a historian collects like seeds, small, perhaps accidental, until the field yields a harvest of catastrophe. The seed that would bloom into treachery was the blade. They called it by many names in later retellings. By those who would not speak further of its provenance, it was the lyre blade, a thing of impossible metallurgy and insinuating shape. It arrived clandestinely, a gift asterisk, or so Fulgrim said asterisk, from a culture whose artisans measured beauty in the language of devotion and madness. The blade's edge did not only cut metal, it lay like a promise in a hand, and it whispered in a voice with many harmonies. Men who stood too close when Fulgrim held it felt a tug at memory, as if a private truth had been rearranged. I do not pretend to know the metaphysics of chaos better than any theologian, but I have listened to survivors and sifted shards of testimony. From those shards emerges a terrible logic. The blade was a vessel, and its song was a language that rearranged desire. It offered Fulgrim answers to questions he had not thought to ask. It flattered his vanity, then deepened it. It was not, at first, a tide that swept him away. It was a mirror that offered him a reflection so dazzling he could not refuse to look. When Ferrus first saw the blade, he did not immediately name it. He saw only the thing as a smith might. Its tempering, its grain, the impossible way that light seemed to bend along its length. It was exquisite, cruelly so. Fulgrim presented it with ceremony, as if unveiling to a brother a new tool of craft. A gift from a realm where beauty is law, the Phoenician said, and his pride carried the sound of worship. Ferrus's hands, silvered, scarred, a testament to the brutal logic that had governed his life, tightened on the haft of his weapon. He could appreciate craftsmanship. He could feel the skill in a blade, the balance. But a blade is an instrument of purpose. When the object's purpose is to seduce, then its artistry is a trap. "Why do you keep it?" Ferrus asked, and his voice was the low hammer of warning. Fulgrim's response was a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Because it is perfect." "Perfectors do not make perfections by themselves," Ferrus said. "They make them with work and necessity. Does this blade have such use?" Fulgrim answered with an evasive elegance. "Use is only one language. There are other tongues to be read. This blade will teach me subtleties of form I have not known." Ferrus felt a cold in that answer, the same cold that had once slid through him when he had seen the first filigreed monument erected where a salvage yard had once stood. He could feel in the cadence of Fulgrim's speech a new ordering. The twins of metal and flesh began to feel like mismatched parts. The first act that bore the stain of the blade's influence was small and cruel. On a world where the Legion had been tasked with rooting out an insurgency, Fulgrim ordered a ceasefire and a parade. He sent troops dancing through the streets, banners alight, to provoke the rebels into slaughtering themselves against a carefully constructed trap. The maneuver succeeded and the rebels were wiped out. The cost: a dozen young iron hands who had been held at a salient for the pageant. Ferrus, who had wanted to cage the rebels and starve them gradually, saw not a victory but a needless flood of blood shaped into a performance. "You made corpses an ornament," he told Fulgrim afterward, counting fingers by the wounded. The Phoenicians' retort was that they had inspired terror, spectacle begetting obedience. Ferrus did not deny that the tactic had its efficacy. He denied the motive. From then on, The raids and sieges that bore Fulgrim's signature became more intricate, more theatrical, until the line between artistry and theater and atrocity blurred. Men were sacrificed for tableaus that would be sung later, banners hoisted amid the ash of those who had bled. Ferrus watched his legion give itself over in small increments, in smiles and oath pledges, until the machinery of their being had the gloss and cast of something newly hollow. The blade's whisper is not always a voice that commands. Sometimes it is a soft suggestion that realigns the stakes. Fulgrim began to ask questions about purification that Ferrus had never considered. If flesh is frail and iron more enduring, did not some existences deserve erasure to perfect the whole? Ferrus saw himself confronted by logic he had once held, retooled into amorality. The doctrine that had guided him now cut him as if it were angled by someone else's hand. As the Phoenician fell further into the blade's embrace, he encountered emissaries, wiles and prophets of a cosmos Ferrus had only read of in the margins. Secret trysts were held in the hum of Fulgrim's private quarters, where minstrels sang in tongues that made listeners forget where they were. Soldiers spoke of being drawn into strange parlor games, where the rewards were not ranks or metal, but a feeling of being in the presence of the absolute. It sounds petty to a historian, perhaps, to catalog the trinkets. Yet every trinket became a node through which chaos threaded its influence deeper into the heart of a man who was already susceptible because he hungered to be admired. Ferrus's disbelief hardened into anger, not the moment he saw Fulgrim with the blade, but the moment Fulgrim refused the admonitions that had once been accepted without hesitation. Ferrus attempted to reason with him in private, appealing to shared campaigns and older bonds. He met the Phoenician in chambers lined with maps, in the belly of ships, in ruined temples where the echoes still held the aftertaste of old fights. Each time Ferrus spoke of duty, Fulgrim replied with rhetoric about destiny and perfection. "We were made for more than iron," Fulgrim said. "We were made to inspire. The blade shows the way." "You brandish it like a creed," Ferrus replied, "and you will lead men into its nameless hunger." Fulgrim's eyes seemed not cruel but far away, looking to some horizon Ferrus could not see. "You are stern, brother. You would turn the universe into a ledger and call it salvation. I will have no ledger. I will have a gallery." That was the moment the last pieces of childhood cracked into dissonant shards. Ferrus felt more than he reasoned, that the man who loved art more than life was beyond reach. Love in war is not simple. It is an alloy of affection and command. But the alloy bends differently under heat. Ferrus's love was not the sentimental grasp of a friend. It was hard, brusque, the kind that placed an arm around a shoulder and expected the grip to hold when the field turned. When Fulgrim removed himself, when he embraced a perfection that required the sacrificial lambs of spectacle, Ferrus felt a betrayal more intimate than treachery, an apostasy of identity. The political consequences were immediate. Fulgrim's followers gained positions that allowed his aesthetic to inflect broader policies. He began to draft campaigns that, under the pretense of demonstrating the Imperium's magnificence, placed strategic assets in positions of vulnerability. Ferrus attempted to mitigate the damage where he could, reallocating reserves, demanding redundancies, and sometimes openly countermanding Fulgrim's orders when the cost seemed too grave. The two men's commands intersected in ways that produced friction and waste. Supplies were misallocated, timing windows missed, and lives paid the bill. Iron hands muttered in their barracks. "The Phoenician has the ear of the courts," they whispered. "He brings music to the halls. We bring work to the foundries." Fulgrim's adherents answered with their own murmurs. The iron hands are soiled by their preoccupation with survival. They need vision. The rhetoric hardened factional lines, and the sense that the Imperium could tolerate both hands and blades on a single table diminished. The turning point was not merely a disagreement over tactics. It was tragically a betrayal of oath. Fulgrim, seduced to the point of worship, no longer merely favored artfulness. He embraced an opposite cause. He and his hand-picked cohorts accepted gifts and rites from entities that would later be named and cursed. In secret rites performed in the dark of conquered worlds, rituals at which pipes burned strange incense and voices chanted in unhuman cadences. Fulgrim offered homage where the Emperor's name once lay central. The doctrine of perfection metastasized into an allegory for supremacy of the self over duty. When Ferrus learned of a particular rite, of children taken from orphanages to be trained as living art, their bones and faces arranged into living tableaus, he confronted Fulgrim in fury. The Phoenician was not surprised. He had been waiting, an artist eager for the final unveiling. "You have made monsters in the name of beauty," Ferrus said, and the words were brittle. "You have made art of the weak." Fulgrim's smile was patient. "Weakness is a mold on perfection. We excise the mold and the sculpture is purer." "You mutilate flesh," Ferrus said. "You call it refinement." Fulgrim shrugged, and in that gesture Ferrus saw both disdain and pity. "You insist on the sanctity of what rots. I will insist on the sanctity of what aspires." Ferrus's hand closed into a fist at his side. The choice presented itself, not in the abstract, but as a set of actions. Either he would stand idly by as Fulgrim transformed, or he would act to stop him. The Primarch's duty bent him to law and oath. The brother in him saw the Phoenician not as some abstraction, but as a beloved friend who had lost his way. That contradiction, of oath and affection, became the core of Ferrus's torment. For a while he tried to thread both loyalties. He issued commands to curtail abuses without naming Fulgrim. He moved to protect orphanages and repair depots that Fulgrim's policies endangered. He sent captains to interpose where he could. But the more he compensated, the more Fulgrim expanded his dominion. The Phoenician's charm, once a source of camaraderie, now had the power to hypnotize officers into compliance. Some of Ferrus's oldest men were seduced by Fulgrim's rhetoric. Officers who had once stood in Ferrus's vanguard now returned to their banners with new icons sewn into their uniforms, symbols of an allegiance Ferrus did not recognize. The betrayal became explicit in a campaign that would be recorded with the name of a star system that would later be a byword for horror. Fulgrim opened the campaign by promising a great gift to the Emperor, a smithing of worlds into aesthetic monuments that would serve as beacons of Imperium's greatness. The plan, in public, was extravagant but plausible. In private, Fulgrim's cohorts performed ceremonies and spoke in tongues that called not for the Emperor, but to forces beyond comprehension. Ferrus realized too late that the spectacle was a smokescreen. The Phoenicians' forces had been augmented by alien cultists, cults that Fulgrim had welcomed in his hunger for forms unknown. In the center of the operation, at the heart of the staged triumph, Fulgrim set a ritual to open a door, not of architecture but of being. The lyre blade sang. The music bounded through the ranks and found open ears. Men who had never erred found their desires reshaped. The legionaries of the Emperor's children, drunk with a new sense of destiny, turned on those who were still cautious. The Iron Hands, who had been charged with a proximate objective, found themselves betrayed on the field by soldiers who had become not merely misguided but enemies. Ferrus's rage in that moment was not the bright flare of fury, but an accumulated, heavy propulsion of iron against bone. He led his men into the heart of the betrayal, hammers raising like the fall of a mountain. He expected a clash of arms, perhaps a duel with his brother that would either restore equilibrium or rend it further. What he met was a tableau of corruption. Fulgrim at the center, rapt, eyes glazed with a godlike fever, the lyre blade in hand and singing its obscene song. Around him, his followers moved in sinuous patterns, beautiful and terrible, their faces altered into masks of joy and hunger. "Fulgrim," Ferrus said, and his voice broke through the cacophony like an anvil's ring. "You have broken your oath." Fulgrim turned as if to a familiar song. "I have remade it," he replied. The blade's presence made his voice too smooth, too practiced. "We remake the universe. We will free men from the chains of decay." "You free them into chains," Ferrus said. You offer them an endless hunger. Fulgrim's smile was the last thing Ferrus recognized. There is no hunger where perfection reigns, he said. Then the Phoenician lifted the blade. What followed was both intimate and epic. Ferrus ran like a machine directed by the purest of instincts. The iron hands crashed into the columns of men who had once been their brothers. The clang of metal was an orchestra of grief. Ferrus found himself beside Fulgrim, an island of survival amid the tide of treachery. They clashed, not as two generals on a diagram, but as a man with a past and an example of a future, as two bodies that had once clasped forearms in victory and now tore at each other with the violence of lovers betrayed. Their duel was not only of arms but of ideologies. Ferrus swung with the measured, inexorable strikes of someone who knew how to end things efficiently. Fulgrim countered with elegance that had been sharpened to a weapon. The lyre blade did not simply wound, it spoke. Each cut seemed to rearrange Ferrus's memory, to suggest that some compromises had always been possible, that perhaps the ledger had room for illusions. Ferrus felt these insinuations like poison, a corrosion that threatened to make his hands tremble. He fought against the blade's voice almost as fiercely as he fought Fulgrim's steel. At one point, as their weapons crossed and sparks scattered, Ferrus saw the face he had known for decades and reached for it, not with a hammer but with words. Do you not remember the Tarsing vaults, the men we carried out on our shoulders, the vows we made to the Emperor? His voice broke. He was not pleading for victory, he was pleading for a brother to remember. Fulgrim's eyes softened for an instant and Ferrus believed he might reach him. For half a breath, a memory of laughter by a ruined gate shimmered between them. Then the lyre blade sang and Fulgrim's pupils rolled like black beads. The softness left like a cloud torn by wind. Fulgrim's hand moved, and the blow came that split the air. Ferrus fell not from a single strike but from the accumulation of choices that had been made long before. Pride had been his virtue and his fault alike. His belief that strength was embodied in the preservation of men had made him slow to suspect the subtler work of corruption. He had been a smith who trusted the grain, not the varnish. And varnish, it seemed, could hide rot until the whole plank gave way. As Ferrus collapsed, bleeding, the battlefield blurred into a smear of color and sound. Around him men fought, died, or fled. Fulgrim stood over him not as a brother, but as a conqueror of the self Ferrus had been. There was no triumph in the Phoenician's gaze, only the cold ecstasy of someone who believed himself to be the living instrument of a new order. You were always so, literal, Fulgrim said, and his words lodged like a shard. You could not hear the music, Ferrus spat blood. You were always so, vain, he managed. You will be judged by the Emperor. Fulgrim's expression was almost pitying. The Emperor will not be the only judge, he said. Then the Phoenician turned away to the men who had already pledged themselves to him in a prayer of iron and ecstasy. Ferrus lay amid the detritus of their history, listening to the dying echo of a name that once bore both hammer and smile. Love and duty had collided, and love had been reshaped into the raw material of an altar. I have written many deaths, and I have tried to make them honest. Ferrus's fall was not a sudden shattering. It was the logical terminus of a course set by choices both deliberate and deluded. He had loved a man who sought to be more than man, and that man had chosen a path that could not be reconciled with the oaths that bound them. The tragedy was made all the crueler because it was personal. Ferrus had not been felled by a stranger or a fate he could not have foreseen. He had been pierced by the slowly widening gap between his creed and Fulgrim's vision. The aftermath was an inferno of retribution, confusion, and sorrow. The traitor army uncoiled like a poisonous flower and spread contagion through neighboring systems. Where Fulgrim's influence took root, the laws of the Imperium faltered under the weight of new cults and altered priorities. The iron hands were shattered by the psychic shock of losing their father, and their coherence as a legion faltered at points until they reconstituted under the sternest of wills. Ferrus's last conscious moments were not spent in hatred. They were spent in a complicated human algebra. He remembered the forge, the taste of cold iron on a winter morning, the sound of his mother's voice as if through a pane of frozen glass. He counted the men who had stood under his banners and felt the weight of their lives like a ledger he could not balance. He thought of duty, of oath, and of the emperor's design. He also thought of Fulgrim's laugh and the way the Phoenician had once sung a blade into being with nothing but a look. Love and duty braided together, then snapped. When the darkness folded in finally, it did so without ceremony. I have heard versions that put an end to the tale in many bright flames: apotheosis, vengeance, redemption. History is kinder to legend. The truth is ragged, a surging, a retreat, a fragmentation. The heresy spread its shadow. Fulgrim's betrayal was complete. His transformation into something worse than a general into a doctrine was not merely political but metaphysical. The man who had once clasped Ferrus's hand in solidarity had become an agent of a cosmos that devoured what he loved in the name of an impossible perfection. I write these things not to inflame old wounds, but to make them known. Betrayal is a lesson a historian owes to the living. It is not enough to speak of blades and battles. One must also talk of the small seductions, the soft exaltations of vanity, and how they accumulate into tectonic shifts. Fulgrim's fall was not merely his own. It was the moment when art turned predatory, when the hunger for beauty learned to eat. Ferrus paid the price with his blood and with a silence that would resound across the ages. In the years that followed, men would argue about culpability and inevitability, about whether Ferrus could have acted differently. I will not absolve him. He was proud. Pride made him blind in ways subtle and pernicious. But to lay his death purely at his own door would be to miss the tragedy's broader shape. It was the shape of two men who loved the same world differently, and in the clash of their loves, the world itself was wounded. When I close this ledger at the end of this chapter, I find myself haunted by an image I cannot shake. Ferrus, in his last hour, reaching for the face of a brother he had raised to be an equal, and finding that the face wore a mask he could not recognize. He reached anyway, because that is what men do, and for that, even through the sorrow, I hold him in the gentlest kind of respect. He tried to be both smith and sentinel, and the cost was his life. Now the trajectory of the heresy accelerates, and the iron that once bound them together will fracture in ways I am not yet ready to recount. But before the cruelty of what follows takes hold, let this account stand as the memory of a betrayal whose roots were not sudden but patient, whose fruits were perverse, and whose final act was the turning of brother into executioner. I have walked battlefields that still smelled of singed cloth and hot metal, and I have listened to dying men tell me stories between ragged breaths. Yet there is something about Istvan V that lays a weight upon my chest I cannot lift. Perhaps it is because that world became, for a day, the center of all the things that once bound brothers together, and the place where those bonds were cleaved. Perhaps it is because what happened there was not only a slaughter of men, but a ripping of a covenant the galaxy had trusted. I write this with hands that tremble not for gore, but for the human arithmetic that led to a ruin so complete that even the dead seemed to understand the meaning of the betrayal. Istvan V was not a place of mercy. It had been chosen for reasons both practical and symbolic. A world of iron-black plains and shallow, jagged seas, where the wind carried the salt of ruined harbors, and the sky wore a permanent bruise of storm. There were no great cities there to be photographed into poems. Its coasts were cluttered with the skeletons of ships and the rust of industry. To the iron hands, it was a stage suited to hammer and anvil. To Fulgrim, however, it promised theater. He had spoken of turning the planet into a tableau so stirring that songs would not suffice to tell it. Statues, mosaics, and the memory of a perfection wrought in flame. The Emperor's children had declared it a canvas. The iron hand saw a battlefield. The armies gathered as the drums of war had called them. Loyal companies under Ferrus Manus, columns of iron hands whose augmetics blinked dimly under the coal sky, and the warped, glittering contingents of the Emperor's children with their strange banners and unsettling music. Between them stretched a no-man's land of scorched regolith and the carcasses of the planet's once proud industry. The air tasted of iron and expectation. Men who had served together in other wars, who had shared bread and blood, stood opposite one another with weapons in hand. Some smiled with the brittle courtesy of those who had never thought they would be forced to kill their friends. Others did not smile at all. Ferrus Manus rode the line like a storm incarnate. He was not a recluse of emotion in that hour. The man was a furnace of duty. There was a coldness to his resolve, but in it lay a terrible clarity. He had become, in the months since Fulgrim's betrayal, both judge and smith, a leader who felt the costs of every action as if it were a physical wound. He had organized his defenders with a single-mindedness that left no room for spectacle. He knew the ground, its crevices and its choke points, and he had placed his men accordingly. He had not come to Eastven 5 to make a statement of art. He had come to end a rot. But I must record the truth. Ferrus did not come without a private theater of his own. In the quiet that preceded the battle he rehearsed, not a battle plan, but a liturgy of retribution. His anger had become a tool as sharp and precise as any blade. He measured it, shaped it, and wrapped it around his intent like a gauntlet. He had told himself, perhaps to calm his iron nerves, that this would be a matter of policy and law. He had told himself, too, that neutrality of heart would be the instrument of justice. It did not occur to him, or perhaps he refused to see, how love could mutate into a different kind of weapon when heated beyond temper. The first hours of the conflict were what one might expect. Columns collided, artillery spat iron, and the sky lit with tracer light and the skittering fire of anti-air batteries. Yet the Emperor's children had altered the map of warfare into performance. They used choruses and flares, and devices that threw illusions across the field. Light that bent like woven glass, banners that quivered with recorded voices calling for brothers to lay down arms. For many of the conscripts and auxiliaries, the effect was bewildering. For veterans who trusted in iron and ordnance, it was a distraction that demanded to be crushed. The sound of the lyre blade was not the sound of ordinary steel. Those who had once stood near Fulgrim and heard it described it as a kind of music that made the marrow ache. On Eastven 5, that music became a weapon. Fulgrim had orchestrated not just armies but atmospheres, waves of sound that crawled into men and suggested 1,000 small renunciations of duty. They were not commands but caresses, insinuations that an easier world awaited if one surrendered to the promise of perfection. Men who had felt themselves whole and guided now found a whisper that said perhaps they could be more if they accepted the blade's teaching. It is a grotesque irony that Ferrus's greatest fault at Eastven 5 was the very virtue that had made him who he was. His pride. Pride is a heavy weight. It can be a ballast that keeps a ship steady, and it can also be a stone that drags a man beneath the waves. Ferrus's pride had hardened into an obstinacy. He believed in the rectitude of the ledger, the cold calculus of duty and survivability. He believed octaves of nuance could be resolved into clear numeric outcomes. Against his brother's siren call, he set the measure of iron. Yet in doing so, he failed to account for the nature of the enemy he faced. He assumed the conflict would remain a contest of arms, when in truth it had already become a war for souls. The second day broke in a sheet of gray rain that washed little away. Ferrus had positioned his veterans along a low ridge ringed by the smashed hulks of industry. They were a wall of metal and resolve. Fulgrim's forces gathered in swirling knots, a choreography of brilliance and menace. They advanced in arcs designed to draw the eye, leaving gaps that promised the illusion of vulnerability. Men followed those lines, some because they admired the display, others because those lines were lined with a kind of promise that sounded as sweet as relief. When Fulgrim struck with a sudden, brilliant thrust, the iron hands found themselves in a gauntlet of temptation as well as steel. I do not mean to suggest that Ferrus was naive. He had foreseen many moves and countered them with grim efficiency. He forbade certain units from chasing bright lures and reconstituted his formations when the enemy tried to peel them away. Yet there are limits to even the best-laid plans. Pride narrowed Ferrus's vision. He began to treat every affront personally, as though the spectacle of Fulgrim's forces were an insult aimed directly at him rather than a political stratagem. Anger is convex. It expands and then focuses, and in Ferrus it focused like a lens. The result was a series of decisions that served honor more than prudence. He ordered assaults into positions where the enemy's artifice had made them appear weak, but which were in fact traps. He refused to allow reserves to be held back for fear they might be used to prop up a rival glory. He broke rules he would have once enforced without exception, driven by the need to punish rather than to preserve. Pride had become a kind of fever within him. It burned his capacity for patient calculation. Men who loved him, and loved the stability he represented, watched as he held to courses that exposed them needlessly. They obeyed because that was the first law of their brotherhood. Obedience, however, does not make the outcome right. Fulgrim wore his intentions like jewelry and moved through the battlefield with almost theatrical serenity. He attacked where he pleased and withdrew where the scene demanded it. His followers, those enthralled by the blade, and those who had been seduced by the idea of being immortalized in song, fought with an abandon that was both terrible and awe-inspiring. To see the Emperor's children in motion at Isven V was to witness soldiers who believed each act might be sculpted into legend. They took risks Ferrus would not, and sometimes the risks paid off. They captured supply nodes quickly, turning them into twisted altars where they could perform rites that dissolved the will of nearby foes. It was as if Fulgrim had weaponized the hunger for narrative and aimed it at the heart of those who still believed in duty alone. The clash of arms, metal on metal, bone on augmetic, was brutal and intimate. I have read reports from the front that give the technical choreography of maneuvers, but the truth that must be recorded is more human. Fathers held dying sons. Brothers covered one another in an instant that felt as long as a life. Men who had once sung at each other's sides wept quietly as the world that had been shared dissolved into fire. There were moments of such thin clarity that even in the crush of combat a man could see his life as a tidy collection of memories. The smell of oil, the sound of a hammer, a laugh shared over a badly cooked meal. Those moments often came before the end. Ferrus and Fulgrim were both on the field that day, and everywhere the battle's tide ebbed and flowed, they found each other like iron seeking the opposite pole. Their encounters were not frequent. Both commanders guarded themselves with bodies and strategy. But when they did meet, it was as if the universe paused in a less than holy silence while history breathed. Their first exchange on Isven V was not one of immediate violence but of words, shouted over the screaming of a shattered engine and the rattle of nearby ordnance. Ferrus's voice carried a different timbre in that hour, not simply commander but wounded elder. Fulgrim, he called, rend these rights and step away. This is not artistry, it is abomination. Fulgrim's reply was softer than Ferrus had expected. Art is a means of transformation, brother. You would have us be instruments only, I would have us be legends. You would turn soldiers into sacrificial props, Ferrus said. And for what? A story. For eternity, Fulgrim answered. There was conviction in the word that spread like a lash. We will be sung. We will not be forgotten. You will be corrupted, Ferrus said. You will become what you hunt. Fulgrim's smile had the edge of sincere pity. You talk as if corruption were a wound. I say it is an evolution. They clashed then, not immediately with blows, but with the violent energy of their beliefs. Soldiers around them surged, and metal sang again. Ferrus's eyes burned with a grief that was almost parental. He saw in Fulgrim the child he had once guided, and the man he had hoped to trust. Fulgrim saw in Ferrus the smith hardened into habit, the man who could not accept beauty's claim on the world. Their perspectives were not merely tactical, they were metaphysical. Each believed their view to be the correct ordering of reality. The duel that would finally end Ferrus's march toward justice was, in a sense, inevitable. Two men whose loves had diverged to such an extent could not meet on neutral ground. The battlefield itself seemed to anticipate the clash, raining debris as if to give cadence to the final act. Ferrus had been wounded earlier, a glancing strike across his shoulder that had bled into the fabric of his armor. The wound did not slow him. If anything, it stoked the fire. He would not allow himself to retreat. He had promised an end to this betrayal and had shaped his day around that promise. They found each other near the wreck of an ancient foundry, its boilers gaping like open throats, its conveyors twisted into black ribs. Around the ruins, the ground was churned into a lunar chaos. The air thrummed with the last chords of the lyre blade, a sound that seemed to bend even the direction of dust. Men fought in the shadow of the two figures, and yet when Ferrus and Fulgrim engaged, it felt as if the rest were extras in a drama whose lead actors were finally unmasked. Their blades met and then sang. Ferrus struck like a man who had spent his life learning to finish things with a minimum of flourish. His blows were powerful, aimed to disable and end. He sought the economy of suffering. Fulgrim answered with a grace that had been refined beyond mere technique. He moved like a sculptor whose hands had been trained to divide matter into form. The lyre blade hummed and made suggestions into Ferrus's mind as the steel crossed. Perhaps compromise could be found. Perhaps a small concession would preserve both honor and life. Perhaps the ledger could be balanced. The insinuations were seductive. They had been part of the blade's art from the moment it had first been sheathed in Fulgrim's hand. Ferrus fought not only his brother but the many voices that had shaped him. Memory tugged, a laughter in the rain, the clank of hammers, the shared oath, and with every tug his resolve flickered. Rage came over him in waves. At Fulgrim's apostasy, at the men who had been corrupted, at the betrayal of his own ideals. His rage narrowed his sight. His strikes became less measured and more about release than result. He wanted, at that moment, to end the man who had reshaped their world. He wanted retribution that would be seen, that would balance the books of his heart. That was his tragic flaw. Pride made him less the commander and more the avenger. Instead of using cunning to undermine Fulgrim, he sought to cleave him and carry that cleaving like evidence that his way was pure. He threw himself into the fight with a fury that in another time would have been admirable, and in that instant it was fatal. Their duel toppled into a wider melee. Soldiers fought over the ruins, and the rhythm of war swallowed the rhythm of the duel. Ferrus, daring to end it, delivered a strike meant to finish, an overhead, brutal and uncompromising. Fulgrim moved with an elegance that seemed almost preordained. He spun beneath the blow with an economy of motion that carried his own edge to a precise point. The lyre blade found purchase, not merely in Ferrus's armor, but in the soft place where flesh met steel. It pierced through the gap between augment and bone, and in that instant something older than pride seemed to laugh. The blade did more than cut. It sang a note through the Primarch, a thing that twisted memory and inflamed pain. Ferrus felt as he had never felt before, both the searing loss of blood and the deeper, more corrosive loss of certainty. The pain made him furious in a way that blurred sense. His hammer fell again and again, each blow an attempt to claw back the coherence the blade had momentarily stolen. For a moment Ferrus thought of all the small choices that had led him here. He thought of the orphaned children he had tried to protect, of the serfs who had been turned into instruments, of the prayers they had once offered to the emperor. The ledger of his life unrolled before him like a scroll of burnt parchment, and he wanted to write a line across it that would set the record straight. He wanted to die in a way that would not let the world forget that some loves were worth defending. Fulgrim, standing above him, did not gloat. There was a sadness in his face that made the blade's music sound almost tender. He did not speak of triumph. He spoke of inevitability. "You still see the world in functions and repairs," he said softly, as if lamenting an old friend's stubbornness. "I am beyond your ledger." Ferrus spat blood and reached, as he had in the days before, for the human part of the man he had loved. "Fulgrim," he said, his voice a ragged thing that still held authority despite the weakness, Remember what we swore." Fulgrim's hand hesitated, and for a breath the battlefield seemed to hold its breath with them. Soldiers paused, caught in the strange hush that comes when two men faced with each other remember a time before war. There was a look then, a place Ferrus had seen in Fulgrim's face in happier hours, and Ferrus grasped at it as if a drowning man might grasp at a rope. But the lyre blade sang again, and the melody that had wrapped Fulgrim's heart was not simply seduction. It was answer. The blade's voice told him that sacrifice for perfection was sanctified, that to remold the universe by cutting away the weak was to achieve a beauty the Emperor could not conceive. The notes were layered and persuasive, and Fulgrim's hand moved as if directed by a will that was not entirely his own. With the motion came the finality. The lyre blade drove home in a slash that did not only sever flesh but carved the truth out of the day. Ferrus's last breath came with more complexity than simple pain. In those final moments, he felt both the iron law he had loved and a profound sorrow that he had failed to shepherd his brother away from darkness. He saw images, men he had raised, the forge still warm in memory, the Emperor's intentions, and then the light dimmed around them. Fulgrim stepped back as if freed of a burden. The music of the blade faded like a requiem. Around them, men continued to fight, but the duel's center had ended. Where once there had been two brothers who had fought and laughed beside one another, there was now a man with blood on his hands who looked like a figure recast in some unknown metal. There was no shout of triumph that could cover the silence that fell over Ferrus's body. The iron hands who had survived drew close and lifted their fallen Primarch with the mechanical precision of men who knew how to carry weight. Their faces were not heroic, they were hollowed by loss. I will not invent a bright moral finale for this chapter. There is no cinematic redemption that neatly wraps the tragedy. Fulgrim's forces recoiled and then consolidated their gains. The tide of the Greater Heresy continued to spread, as if the universe had been given a new order to test. The iron hands were left with grief and a new hardening that would alter their soul. The men who had watched Ferrus die did not immediately seek vengeance so much as a reconstitution of their purpose. They had lost a father and a questioner. They would become, in the months to come, something different in the attempt to survive. Eastven 5 was a crucible in the literal sense, iron tested by fire and then melted into a new alloy. The cost was immeasurable. Families were hollowed out, entire cultural nodes burned, and the Legion's cohesion frayed in places where the psychic shock of betrayal had been worst. For the Emperor's children, the day was a triumph of sorts, but not a simple one. They had taken a price that would later weigh on their gilded blazon. Fulgrim's victory was not merely over a man, but over a memory. He had rewritten history by decisive cruelty. Yet even as he stood amid the wreckage with the blade's echo in his ears, something in him must have been lost. A man cannot be traded for a doctrine without some part of his self being changed irreparably. My own grief in recounting Eastven 5 is not only for the death of Ferrus Manus, but for the way in which an entire order of valor, one that prized stoicism and the preservation of men, was driven to a repressive fierceness that would harden into obsession. The iron hands took their Primarch's loss and made of it a new catechism. Never again would weakness be tolerated. Never again would the slackness of sentiment be allowed to rot the limb of the Legion. There is pragmatism in that reaction, and there is a blunt cruelty in it too. Both have outcomes that we will recount in the pages to come. I close this part of the chronicle with the image that will not leave me. Ferrus Manus, lying among the twisted ribs of a foundry, his silvered hand still reaching toward a brother who could not answer. Around him the wounded and the dead lay, and smoke crawled over the planet like an implacable tide. The sky above Eastven 5 remembered the battle like an old wound. The ground would hold the scars. Men on both sides would carry the day's harm for the rest of their lives. The betrayal was complete. The brotherhood sundered on a plane of iron and grief. History, if it is honest, will not close the book with that image alone. It will go on to tell of reprisals, of councils, of the slow reconfiguration of a legion into something harder and colder. It will tell of the Emperor's response, of the tragedies unfurling elsewhere in the galaxy as heresies spread their shadow. But for now, in the aftermath of Eastven 5, the sound in my ears is not politics or strategy, but the memory of a man's last breath and the stillness that followed. That silence is not empty. It is the shape of a wound that will define the Iron Hands for generations. I write these pages with hands that remember the weight of another man's hand. The ink at my fingertips seems inadequate to bear the memory of what followed Eastven 5. The ledger of loss is larger than any folio. When a leader dies upon a field of battle, a body falls and then a world responds. Sometimes with ceremony, sometimes with anger, sometimes with slow, careful reconstruction. But when the Primarch of a legion dies as both father and symbol, the reaction is not merely administrative. It is a psychic convulsion. The Iron Hands did not simply bury a leader. They faced the implosion of a meaning they had spent a lifetime manufacturing. For weeks after the battle, the Legion moved like a thing recovering from a fever. Men who had once taken their augmetics for granted stood and stared at the parts of themselves they could no longer explain. The most practiced among them, veterans who had fought by Ferrus's side for decades, found that rituals of mourning and maintenance no longer anchored them. Where once a morning hymn to the forge could steady a mind, now there were sudden tremors in the psyche, ghost limbs that itched with phantom loyalties, and dreams in which the Primarch's silvered hands were both a comfort and an accusation. I spoke with machine priests who confessed, in whispered tones that smelled of oil and sweat, to interrogating their own rituals for a sudden lack of meaning. The rites do not answer like they used to, one admitted to me, an old man with lamps set into the hollows of his cheeks. We perform the litanies, but the echoes are different. It is as if the grooves have been filed. The immediate consequence was organizational chaos, communication channels clogged with grief. Commands that once moved with metronomic certainty were delayed, while captains argued over priorities and funerary requirements. Ferrus's death was not only a physical rupture, it was a vacancy in the conceptual architecture of the Legion. Who, now, set the scale between preservation and sacrifice? Who measured the balance where the cost of a life might be justified by the gain of a material advantage? The answer, when it came, was not a single man but a new body of governance, the Iron Council. It is important to record how the Iron Council formed, because its birth marked a pivot as critical as any battle. The name suggests a single entity, but it was, at first, an uneasy confederation. Tech marshals, forge priests, senior captains, master artificers, and a handful of senior officers who had both the trust of the ranks and the coldness to make hard choices came together in a prolonged vigil. They gathered in the bones of Ferrus's command ship, around forges still warm with the Primarch's last tasks. Debate raged until argument hardened into policy. There were nights when the council sat and did not resolve anything. There were other nights when they moved with sudden, savage clarity, issuing mandates for the requisition of forges, the reallocation of marines, the consolidation of holdings. Eventually, a formality became law. The Iron Council was declared the Legion's executive, charged with both the material defense of the Iron Hands and the preservation of their doctrine. The composition of the council deserves mention, because it was both pragmatic and symbolic. Tech marshals, men whose bodies were as much machinery as mind, held significant voice. They were followed closely by those captains who had not been seduced by Fulgrim's theatrics, and who still measured victory by lives preserved rather than by songs sung. The forge priests carried the spiritual weight. They interpreted Ferrus's creed and turned it into ritualized law. To a historian, this seems sensible, a legion reconstituting itself with the instruments that had sustained it. But what transpired was hardly neutral. The council did not merely administer, it legislated an emotional architecture. Where Ferrus had once taught augmentation as pragmatic salvation, the council codified it as moral imperative. Their first edict was a series of public funerary rituals that were stark and unadorned. No statuary carved in brilliant filigree, no elaborate dirges. Instead, Ferrus's effigy was laid within a forge, and the heat was turned low so that metal softened and did not warp. The image was deliberate, to harden but also to preserve. The rites were clinical, designed to avoid the seductive flourish that had cost them a Primarch. Soldiers who had expected ceremony left with a feeling of incompleteness. Those who had feared spectacle were relieved. In the weeks after the funeral, the Iron Council moved quickly to consolidate power by invoking the language of fidelity. "We continue the work the Primarch began," they said. "We must remove the weakness that allowed betrayal." The message was simple. Its implications were not. Grief in the Legion took forms that were public and forms that were secret. In barracks, the men sang the old hymns, louder than before, as if volume could stave off the hollowness. In private, some sought solace in metal, the old, honest fix of welding flesh to machine, until the seams were not only practical but defensive. There were new requests for augmentation. Men who had resisted bionics now asked for them without hesitation. Mothers who had once been reluctant to see sons tempered in iron writhed in a confusion I will not pretend to understand. Some urged their children forward in fervor, believing that making their children less vulnerable would honor the man who had fallen. The council did not oppose such choices. It encouraged and sometimes mandated the replacement of vulnerable tissue with cold alloy. In time, the imperative shifted from optional amelioration to a disciplined program of enhancement. That program was not only medical but philosophical. The council set forth a series of doctrines that would come to define the Iron Hands for centuries. At its core lay a principle that read like Ferrus's creed taken to an absolute conclusion, that weakness must be excised wherever it appeared. But the council's doctrine added a layer of juridical certainty. If weakness could exist in a body, it could also exist in institutions, in sympathies, and in memory itself. Thus they concluded that the Legion's future required the minimization of exceptions, the purification of sentiment, and the building of a new ethic in which the endorsement of augmentation was a moral duty. The programs were implemented in ways both blunt and subtle. Forge halls were expanded. Scarring procedures that had once been rare were systematized. The tech marshals refined prosthetics and sought to make them more efficient, more durable. But even more telling were the new training regimens. Drills that stripped away humor, exercises that replaced story time with calculations, meditations on failure that were meant to teach men to see loss as data rather than tragedy. Stories about past triumphs were not prohibited. They were cataloged, archived, and converted into metrics to be studied for error and improvement. Emotion was not banned. It was quantified and then pruned. There were, inevitably, resistances. Not all Iron Hands welcomed the shift. Some captains, older than the council, chafed at its directives. They mourned the man Ferrus had been, not only the Primarch who demanded efficiency, but also the leader who had occasionally allowed for mercy. A few spoke out, urging the council to temper its zeal with compassion. They were not muted by persecution so much as by attrition. Some were reassigned to backwater theaters where their dissent could not sway the center of power. Others quietly retired to keepers of relics, removed from command. A handful left entirely, seeking refuge with other legions or independent houses. Their departures, when they occurred, were recorded in the minutes of the council as necessary reorganizations. The language of administration does that strange thing of making heartbreak into expediency. As a chronicler, I must confess an uncomfortable truth. My own presence among the survivors influenced what I recorded and how I recorded it. In the early months, I found myself invited to council briefings, not as a policymaker but as an observer and, perhaps, a witness. The men who spoke there wanted their acts to be recorded. They wanted a human mind to bear witness that they had not acted in cold blood, but in a kind of moral urgency. And yet my notes betray the temperature of the meetings. The words urgency and necessity appear often, as if a plea for justification had crept into the minutes. I watched younger officers sign decrees with a kind of steady desperation that made the pen feel heavier than it should have been. There were, too, more intimate consequences. The Iron Hands began ritual procedures intended to blunt the possibility of treachery repeating itself. Soldiers were taught to read one another for signs of wavering loyalty. Oaths were strengthened, sealed with augmentations that bore biometric locks tied to the Legion's databases. In the quiet sanctums of certain forge priests, there were conversations about the prophylactic removal of organs that might house the seeds of sentimental weakness, a notion that reads as barbaric even on paper. Some proposals were rejected, others, dangerously, were implemented in limited scope, justified under the guise of preventive sacrifice. These are not the sorts of acts that make men proud in hindsight. They are instead the desperate decisions of a body that has been wounded and now trembles at every shadow. The Iron Hand civic culture shifted as well. Where once laughter and small camaraderie had been common in mess halls, conversation turned to efficiency and to the calculation of risk. Children of sanctioning worlds were presented with the choice to be trained in the cold arts of repair rather than in song. The Legion's external posture hardened. Embassies were made functional, gifts were pragmatically selected, and alliances were negotiated as equations. Fulgrim's example had taught a terrible lesson, that beauty could seduce and destroy, and the Council determined that detachment was the remedy. Thus, emotional distance was promoted from being a private coping mechanism to being an institutional virtue. And yet, in corners where the light still fell through ruined skylights, human things stubbornly persisted. I found small pockets where men still told stories of Ferrus that were not reduced to edicts or metrics. An old weaponsmith kept a battered hammer Ferrus once used and, in his broken way, polished it and told apprentices stories of the Primarch's wry humor. A pair of brothers, both veterans, shared a boiled ration and laughed about a foolish campaign promise the Primarch had once made in a moment of ill repose. These human residues mattered to me. They were a counterweight to the Council's stepwise program. They suggested that even under the coldest cloak, warmth will remain. Whether that warmth could survive into a future where touch was minimized and augmentation normalized was another question, and one that would be answered in the years to come. The Council, for its part, was not blind to these undercurrents. It tried to incorporate them without returning to the excesses that had birthed Fulgrim's decadence. A doctrine of remembrance emerged, ritual that was precise and austere, not ornate. Commemoration was permitted, but it was to be disciplined. The Council argued that memory should inform improvement. Sentiment without purpose was dangerous. In debates, they would quote Ferrus himself with a chilling exactitude, turning the Primarch's blunt phrases into clarion calls for hardening. The effect was to create a new mythology, Ferrus as the paragon of unyielding will, rather than Ferrus as a man who had once laughed at the sight of storm iron. For me, witnessing the Council's transformation of Ferrus's memory felt like watching a smith take a hammer and reshape a family heirloom into a tool. There was function and there was sacrilege. I tried to record both with fidelity. The Iron Hands were rebuilding, but they were building a different edifice than the one Ferrus would likely have recognized. Their external relations followed the inward shift. Where once the Iron Hands might have cooperated more freely with allied forces, they now suspected sentiment as a vector for corruption. Diplomatic ties were kept purposeful and short. Long alliances were discouraged unless they produced easily calculable benefits. The Legion's interactions with other imperial forces were perfunctory. They offered assistance where necessary but refused cultural exchange. This isolation was both defensive and aggressive. It protected the Legion from contamination at the cost of mutual understanding. The transformation into a machine-like entity was not merely physical or administrative. It was also metaphysical. The Iron Hands began to emphasize a logic, a mode of thinking that prized systems over stories, algorithms over anecdotes. The council instituted what they called the Grand Calculation, a regimen of study and testing intended to identify and quantify types of failure. It was meant to be scientific, and in many ways it was, but its ethical temperament was stark. Failures were examined, dissected, and converted into prescriptions that often recommended the reduction of variables considered soft: love, mercy, unpredictability. Where the ledger suggested anomalies, the council proposed standardization. Over time, men constrained their private lives to conform to public protocols. Marriages were sanctioned only when they served to produce capable technicians. Artistic expression was tolerated only when it served training. The line between necessity and orthodoxy blurred. It is tempting, and perhaps lazy, to paint the Iron Hand's transformation as a simple moral failing. A legion hardens and loses its humanity. The reality is subtler and crueler. Many men who embraced augmentation did so because they had been freed from fear. With prosthetic eyes, they could stare into darkness without superstition. With reinforced lungs, they could enter toxic air without terror. There were benefits. The Legion's combat effectiveness, at least by certain measures, increased. Its capacity to endure horrific environments grew. Men survived wounds that in previous centuries would have been fatal. The engineering strides achieved in those years were astonishing. The problem lay not with the iron itself, but with the ideology that made iron the primary metric of worth. The ideological turn had human costs. At 100 different funerals, I recorded the hollow hush of families, where children had been encouraged to join the legions not out of love, but as part of a larger societal calculation. A mother confided in me that she had signed her son's name to a line of augmentation simply because she trusted the council's judgment more than her own instincts. In another port, a young Marine approached me and asked whether the Primarch would have approved of his decision to replace his failing heart with a pump. He expected counsel. I could only offer questions. "Ask whether you do it for yourself," I said quietly, "or for others' memory." The new Iron Hands were efficient. They were relentless. They no longer indulged what they called unnecessary humanization. Their campaigns were surgical, aimed at vulnerabilities with the precision of a lathe. There was a terrible poetry to it, a mathematics of survival that could be admired for its elegance, even as one recoiled at its moral cost. Over the course of rebuilding, the Legion executed operations that cleaned pockets of heresy and Xeno's influence with a brutal clarity. They were effective because they removed variables and followed data. But in doing so, they also removed the scaffolding of compassion that had once made them human. It is necessary, at this point in the chronicle, to return to the question of legacy. Ferrus Manus's death created a paradoxical inheritance. On the one hand, his creed had been about overcoming the frailty of flesh through augmentation and discipline. On the other hand, his death had been the catalyst for an absolutist interpretation that mourned weakness not as a human condition to be aided, but as a malignancy to be excised. Was that the legacy he intended? I do not believe so. Ferrus was a man of iron and also of complex tenderness, a leader who saw augmentation as salvation in specific cases rather than a mandate for wholesale erasure. Yet a legacy is like any artifact. It is refracted through those who remember it. The Iron Council refracted it through fear, and fear is a powerful distorting lens. As for me, Gas Havelock, I have tried to name the grief plainly. To record is to try to hold meaning against the tide of forgetting. I remember, for instance, a night when I sat within the smelting halls with an apprentice tech priest who had once been a boy Ferrus had lifted from a mud village and trained. The boy, now a man whose hair had been replaced with braided copper, told me of the Primarch's quiet humor. He used to leave his cup on an anvil and pretend it was a throne, he said, and then smiled in a way that was almost childlike. We laughed. He liked to see whether we would laugh with him. The man's eyes betrayed a heat he rarely permitted himself. It was the memory of smallness amid a life that now demanded so little softness. These anecdotes are not mere nostalgia. They are proof that the Iron Hands, even in their rebirth, carried human traces. The transformation was not absolute. Men could harden their minds and also preserve a secret tenderness. The council's edicts might legislate detachment, but the human heart is a recalcitrant organ. I have confidence that wherever men recall a Primarch's laugh or a captain's brief kindness, those recollections will shape choices in ways the council cannot always predict. Yet there is another, darker confidence I have. Institutions once shaped by fear are slow to unlearn their habits. The Iron Hands turned toward mechanization became self-reinforcing. New generations were raised in doctrine. Training systems codified practices that favored efficiency and reduced the space for spontaneous mercy. Where once Ferrus had been a living mediator of values, now the council's manuals served as the mediation. The resulting culture was one where calculation trumped sentiment not as an occasional judgment, but as a baseline. In the last months I spent with the Legion before I left to write these chronicles, I encountered a phenomenon that disturbed me more than any policy debate: the ritualization of grief into motivation. At memorials, men did not only mourn, they demonstrated. They would raise their prosthetic arms and recite lists of failures that had been converted into corrective measures. A young lieutenant, in a speech that could have been poetry if not for its coldness, vowed that no man would die from a failure the Legion could anticipate. The crowd cheered. It was moving in its own way, but it was also the flattening of pain into a program. Pain, in that context, was not a teacher to be felt but data to be optimized. My duty as historian compels me to present both the size and the shape of what I witnessed. The Iron Hands survived. They rebuilt. They became, in many respects, stronger. They became less vulnerable to seduction by beauty in the fashion Fulgrim had exploited. They became, at the same time, less capable of certain kinds of mercy. Whether this was a price worth paying is not a question I will answer for them. I only offer the observation that Ferrus's legacy was complicated by the circumstances of his death, and that complication produced both remedies and new wounds. In the quiet that follows the chapter, I close with a final image. An old tech priest, one of Ferrus's first apprentices, bending over a small crucible in a light that looked, for a moment, like the embers of dawn. He smoothed a seam, murmured a litanic phrase, and then, with a small, almost secret smile, set aside the finished part and placed near it a scrap of cloth, a souvenir from the Primarch's cloak. The two items lay side by side, metal and cloth, function and memory. The tech priest's hands were steady. He had learned to bind both. I saw in that gesture the true ambivalence of the Iron Hands. They would press forward into a future of greater iron, but they would always carry the soft relics of a life that had once taught them to love. That, perhaps, is the most honest thing I can record. Institutions evolve, but people persist. The Iron Hand's rebirth was violent and decisive. It was also, in pockets, tender and messy. Both truths are real. Both will shape the Legion's story in ways I do not yet fully comprehend. For now, I place these pages in the archive and add my small voice to the memory. The Legion has endured a terrible loss and has chosen a path that many will envy for its clarity and many will curse for its hatred of softness. History will judge them in time. I can only continue to bear witness. I have followed the Iron Hands for years, moved with their columns, slept beneath canvases scorched by their ordinances, and watched the slow accretion of their laws. To try to tell what became of them after the heresy is to attempt to describe a machine that learned to imagine itself a city. Functional scaffolds everywhere, rooms for grief locked away, corridors that hum with purpose. They rebuilt not only their hulls and banners, but a philosophy. They hammered doctrine into ritual and ritual into habit. The rebirth was not a single moment, but a long, deliberate manufacturing. After Ferrus Manus fell, the Legion's wounds hardened into armor. The Iron Council shepherded that process, and it created the Grand Calculation, a program of doctrine, analysis, and engineering that became the Legion's heartbeat. The name is grand because its ambition was. It sought not merely to prevent the recurrence of heresy, but to turn the prevention into a science. Where once Ferrus had felt instinctively for balance, the Council developed methods to quantify weakness, predict failure, and allocate corrective measures with the arithmetic of a lathe. It was a response born of fear, and fear is an exacting tutor. The Grand Calculation was both policy and catechism. In the beginning, it was a ledger catalogues of campaigns, ratios of loss to success, statistical models of siege attrition. But like all great devices in a military age, it acquired a spirit. Engineers, tech marshals, and data priests wove metrics into doctrine. They built simulators and models, ran thousands of virtual engagements to find where human choice introduced variance, and then drafted procedures to choke off those variances. What could not be modeled or quantified was not trusted. What could be reduced to an algorithm was elevated. A captain's report that included an emotional justification for a decision was treated as a contaminant and would be cross-checked against the calculation's output. If the emotion persisted as a factor in command after correction, the Council moved to discipline it. At first, this seemed simply prudent. The Imperium is a hungry thing that punishes errors with attrition. In that climate, the Grand Calculation delivered results. Engagements became cleaner, supply losses dropped, augmentation programs improved survival rates. A legionary who would once have bled out in minutes now lived to learn, and his durability increased the Legion's tactical endurance. Engineers developed more reliable joints, cleaner neural interfaces, and implants that tracked microsigns of stress and loyalty. The Iron Hands adapted faster than many thought possible. They became harder to surprise, and those who opposed them learned to respect and fear the hidden math behind each maneuver. But the calculation's purity had costs. It taught the Legion to see people as systems. When something in a battalion did not conform, the Council's method did not ask, why, in a human voice. It computed. It recommended removal, correction, replacement. Sympathy became a parameter to be minimized because it introduced noise. Rituals of mourning were standardized and measured for their psychological half-life. Anything beyond that half-life was deemed inefficiency. Even training included sessions in which recruits were taught to report if a brother's behavior deviated from expected curves. Paranoia wrapped itself in the mantle of precaution and took its seat as doctrine. Vengeance colored all of this. It was not the hot vengeance of a day's fever, but a long, grinding program. Ferrus's death was catalogued in the calculation as a prime example of the cost of emotional susceptibility. The Council declared that their charge was not only to preserve lives, but to avenge the dishonor inflicted upon the Legion. Vengeance became an institutional vector, measured, planned, and executed with the precision of an assembly line. Campaigns were designed not merely to purge traitors, but to remove the conditions that could let seduction take root. Sanctuaries, cults, artisan enclaves, and the networks of patronage and taste that Fulgrim had exploited. This vengeance was not aesthetic. It was cold and operational. When a world was suspected of harboring cultist influence, the Grand Calculation mapped the probable nodes of corruption: markets, guild houses, cultural institutions. The Iron Hand struck at those nodes with targeted force, raids, information campaigns, surgical occupation. They stripped the cultural scaffolding out of societies to make them less hospitable to decadence. The result was effective and brutal. Cities that had once sang with artisan song were reduced to regulated manufactoria that produced parts and not poetry. To some allies, this was salvation. To many more, it was a tyranny cloaked as protection. Isolation followed naturally. Other legions and imperial agencies reacted predictably to a body so intent on purging ambiguity. Alliances that had once been robust frayed, because the Iron Hands increasingly refused to join coalitions that diluted their methods. Diplomatic overtures that involved cultural exchange or symbolic ceremonies were rebuffed. Where feasible, the Iron Hands preferred to operate alone or in tightly supervised coalitions, where the grand calculation could audit every joint action. They withdrew from forums of mutual counsel, preferring instead a dark network of internal metrics that assured their ascendancy in action and a lesser need for fraternization. The isolation was not only political but physical. The Iron Hands established remote forges in bleak systems, worlds with the same quality of unadorned utility as Medusa, but lacking its paradoxical beauty. They positioned themselves in territories where environmental hazards would thin the numbers of those who might be seduced by ornament. While other legions clustered around centers of population, the Iron Hands embraced the periphery. They became guardians of outlands, clean-up crews whose methodical sweep could scrub a world free of the tangles of decadence and false art. Outposts grew in the dark and became temples of metal. But retreat did not mean irrelevance. If anything, the Iron Hands' presence on the periphery made them indispensable. The great warp storms and the spread of chaos cults demanded a force that could endure hostile conditions without slipping into sentiment. The Iron Hands filled that role. They became the Imperium's fixers, dispatched to lands where infection had taken root and where other legions feared contamination. Their reputation for ruthlessness grew with each purge. In the imperial record, they became both admired for their results and feared for their methods. Governors welcomed them only with the caveat that they would not interfere with the great calculation. Many muttered that this was a worthy price to pay for survival. Others would remember the scars for generations. Chaos remained their prime antagonist, and the Iron Hands learned to meet it with a certain dark competence. The warp is not merely a theater of demons. It is the domain of ideas that seed like mold in damp corners of civilization. The Legion adapted by extending the calculation into metaphysics. They developed techniques to detect psychic distortions and to translate them into anomaly readings. The machine priests would run a field sweep and produce a heat map of corruption measured in data points. Where demons bled into sentiment, the calculation recommended excision, removal of artifacts, neutralization of psychers, and, if necessary, the eradication of communities whose psychic signatures were compromised. These acts were not always military. Often they were clinical purges that targeted institutions rather than only armies. A convent that had begun adopting strange hymns might be stripped and refitted as a repair yard. A guild whose work had begun reflecting alien aesthetics might be dismantled, and its members reassigned to manufacturing tasks under vetting. Where there was a risk of relapse, the council established monitors. In the short term, this prevented many outbreaks of chaos influence. In the long term, it remade entire societies to be less complex and therefore less susceptible to subtle corruption. The Legion's engineers would say, with a correctness that lacked warmth, that simpler systems are more robust. The Iron Hands' attitude toward Xenos was similarly systematic. Alien intelligence is not merely an enemy to be destroyed, but a source of mutation. Technologies, arts, and customs that could seed unwanted variability. The grand calculation treated Xenos artifacts as variables to be neutralized. Where other forces sought to salvage alien tech for advantage, the Iron Hands analyzed the risk, and more often than not, sanctioned destruction rather than appropriation. They valued the cost of contamination higher than the potential boon. In certain theaters, this made them a necessary corrective to opportunists who would flirt with forbidden gains. In other places, it left them standing alone, accused of mutilating knowledge and strangling potential alliances. As they matured into their new identity, the Legion's internal culture hardened in rituals of self-policing that bordered on the institutionalization of suspicion. Men were drilled to notice anomalies in gait, speech, and ritual. The machine priests trained cadres that could adapt augmentations as tools of loyalty enforcement. Biometric locks, Neural scrubbing and loyalty chips were not just protective measures, they became social proof. A Marine might be judged not by his courage in battle, but by how his implants registered against the grand calculations model of expected response. Those whose readings deviated were subject to scrutiny, interviews that were more interrogation than counseling. The social bonds of old gave way to chains of data. Yet even in this mechanized culture, there were sparks that resisted complete conversion. Human memory persisted as a danger and a solace. There were officers who kept private caches of stories that contradicted the council's prescriptions. They would smuggle a bowl of fruit into a mess hall, offer a caprice of indulgence, and watch the way laughter loosened the lines on a man's face. Some of these acts were minor treasons. Others were deliberate proof that humanity need not be an inefficiency. The council tolerated some of this as a controlled variable, but it remained vigilant. Each small indulgence would be measured, catalogued, and judged for risk. Gas Havelock, a chronicler who could not help being humane by trade, found himself both repelled by and fascinated with these pockets. I recorded a story of two veterans who met in a maintenance bay to swap memories over a ration of bad tea. One had replaced his eyes with lenses that could see through walls. The other had a repaired shoulder that whistled faintly when rain came. They spoke of a campaign where they had once waited in silence until dawn revealed the enemy. They spoke not in terms of victory or loss, but of waiting and fellowship. When I asked why they risked meeting in secrecy, one shrugged and answered, "We are still men." The phrase was simple, but it had weight. Beneath the calculation's vast machinery, there were lives that would not be entirely converted. The Iron Hands also developed an ethic of reparative utility. Recognizing that certain augmentations could produce alienation, the Council funded programs to ensure that augmentation served communal purpose. A prosthetic was not merely a weapon. It became a unit of productivity. The Marine with a new arm could lift more, mend more, and thereby justify the replacement in terms the calculation accepted. This reframing made the practice socially acceptable even as it deepened the pressure to conform. Dissenters argued that such utilitarian framing removed moral choice. The Council replied with cold benevolence. Better to be alive and useful than dead and sentimental. Perhaps the most lasting dimension of the reborn Iron Hands was their doctrine of erasure. Weakness was not merely a failure to be fixed, but a potential contagion. The Council's policies began to reflect a philosophy that accepted excision as both medical and moral. In situations where the calculation determined a body, institution, or memory could not be risk-managed, eradication was declared permissible. This principle extended to cultural artifacts, non-compliant leadership, and most troublingly, to communities whose cohesion invited decadence. The logic had a ruthless efficiency: remove the source, secure the system, repeat. Such a principle raised questions outside the Legion that eventually pierced the Imperium's corridors. Some argued that the Iron Hands had crossed a threshold, that in eliminating entire social substrates in the name of security, they had become judge, jury, and executioner by algorithm. Others, desperate in the face of the warp's ravages, applauded them for choosing a painful clarity over paralysis. The political fallout was complex. The Iron Hands were indispensable in certain theaters and distrusted in others. Their roles settled into a kind of enforced autonomy, given freedom in exchange for results. Their interactions with other imperial factions grew more perfunctory, but also more purposeful. When the ecclesiarchy needed a purge of heretical sects that had become too entrenched to be handled by local authorities, the Iron Hands deployed. When a Forge world called for help against a Xenos incursion that had been poorly documented, they arrived and executed with draconian efficiency. In return, they asked little beyond space to operate an authority to enforce their assessments. The Imperium, pragmatic and exhausted, agreed more often than not. This arrangement created a paradoxical prestige. The Iron Hands were feared and respected because they worked. Their campaigns created an impression that the world could be set to rights by a relentless will. But the cost of such reassurance was that other parts of the Imperium ceded a moral domain. They let a legion apply what felt like an extrajudicial ethic under the pretense of data. Over time, that ceded moral authority would shape many lives in ways the Emperor's courts would come to regret. Warfare continued to hammer them into new forms. Each new threat, chaos incursions that took a subtler form, Xeno's ploys that used culture rather than force required adaptations. The grand calculation expanded to incorporate countercultural operations. Propaganda corrected into prosaic channels. Festivals standardized to avoid accidental ritual. Art regulated so it would not serve as a vector for contagion. The Iron Hands learned to fight not only with bolter and blade, but with censorship and reconstruction. They became, by intent, the immune system of the Imperium in sectors where infection was deemed likely. There were moral costs. Entire aesthetics were erased, apprenticeships broken, guilds disbanded. In many systems, this meant that a people's soul was replaced with a production line. The argument that survival matters more than culture is persuasive when one is starving. It becomes more ambiguous when comforts return and the line between preservation and eradication blurs. Those caught in between often found themselves grateful in the short term, resentful in the long. In the end, the Iron Hands remained what they had always been, a force that prized endurance over elegance. They would take on missions no others would, face environments that would shatter weaker Marines, and act with a precision that owed everything to the night of the Primarch's death. Their indomitable will was not merely martial. It was institutionalized as a refusal to accept the soft compromises that had once allowed treachery to bloom. They sought to erase weakness wherever it was found because they feared weakness most of all, the weakness that had let a brother fall to something as seductive as a blade. For me, the most troubling thing about their rebirth is not that they hardened, that was perhaps inevitable, but that they turned their grief into a doctrine that widened the abyss between machine and man. Ferrus Manus had taught that augmentation could save men. The council taught that augmentation must define them. That is a small grammatical difference with enormous ethical consequence. I do not end these pages with an accusation so much as a record of consequence. The Iron Hands survive. They endure. They have become cleaner, faster, and more frighteningly efficient. But that efficiency has a weight that bends the moral frame of whole worlds. Theirs is a future marked by isolation, by the long arithmetic of survival, and by an institutional will that will not cede ground to charm. They are guardians of a sterner order, and they will be both admired and feared for it. If the reader wishes a simple moral, it cannot be found here. I will close, as I have in other chapters, with an image, an outpost at the edge of known space, where the wind scours the metal and the stars hang like cold coins. An Iron Hand squad walks the perimeter, their augmetics making them half sculpture. One among them pauses at a rusted signpost, a relic of a city that once sang, and runs his gloved fingers along the gouged letters. He says nothing. He records the damage into his neural log and moves on. The gesture is small and human, but it is also catalogued. What remains is both machine and man, bound together by vows of endurance and the silent ache of what was lost. The Iron Hands have reborn themselves to survive. In surviving, they have changed. Whether that change is salvation or a further slide into silence is a judgment history will render in its own patient time. I Gas Havelock will keep writing it down. I have carried this tale like a weight in my bones for years. And now, as I set down these final lines, the ledger of the Iron Hands feels less like a closed account and more like a living mechanism that still ticks in the dark. The story I have told is not a simple arc from innocence to corruption or from tragedy to cautionary tale. It is, rather, the slow, complicated calculus of men who chose metal to master mortality and who discovered that metal could master them in return. Ferrus Manus was the fulcrum of that choice. He was not merely a smith of arms, but a smith of men, someone who believed that augmentation and discipline could save fragile lives from the ravages of war. He did not preach the annihilation of feeling. He offered remedies for frailty. Yet his death at the hands of a brother, Fulgrim, bent his doctrine into a more rigid shape. The Iron Council and the grand calculation that followed were responses born of grief and of fear. They were pragmatic, ruthless, and for all their cold logic, deeply human in origin. Fear wrapped itself in data, and grief found expression in policy. That is how institutions mend, not always by returning to what was, but often by building new structures on the ruins. I have watched the Iron Hands become, in many respects, a force of pure utility. Their forges burn cleaner, their prosthetics are marvels, and their campaigns are a study in minimized variance. That efficiency bought lives, secured sectors from corrupting influence, and made them indispensable in theaters where lesser formations would crumble. But if you ask what they lost in exchange, the answer is simple and terrible. They made the world less porous to tenderness. They institutionalized suspicion. They taught men to measure sorrow as data and to excise what could not be predicted. In doing so, they diminished not only the risk of betrayal, but also the spontaneous mercy that once animated small, private acts among warriors. And yet to claim they became mere machines would be to flatten the truth. I have sat in dim bays where veterans polished hammers with the same reverence they once reserved for relics of faith. I have listened to a tech priest whisper Ferrus's old jokes into the ear of an apprentice who had never known the Primarch but who smiled anyway. The Iron Hands wear their steel like a second skin, yes, but beneath that armor there are memories that do not yield to policy. Grief does not become neat because a council decrees it so. It seeps into the seams of ritual and into the quiet moments between maintenance cycles. Men sigh in their sleep and dream of a laugh that used to be real. That persistence of the human heart is the paradox that makes the Iron Hand story both tragic and stubbornly alive. The legacy of Ferrus Manus is thus a doubled thing. One half is the literal inheritance of doctrine, augmentation as salvation, discipline as virtue, and intolerance for weakness that now reads as legislation. The other half is a quieter inheritance, the memory of a man who sometimes allowed for absurd softness, who would let a soldier rest or laugh when that was needed. The council chose the former as policy. The latter lived on in hidden pockets, in stories told by firelight, in a battered hammer kept on a shelf. Both continue to shape the Legion, often in tension with one another. What remains unresolved, and perhaps must remain so, is the balance between machine and humanity. There is no arithmetic that can convert courage into torque or sorrow into a schematic. Some truths are not reducible to the grand calculation. The Iron Hands know this in fragments. They act as if certainty is attainable, and then are surprised when the unknown arrives. Their insistence on erasure of weakness protects them, but also narrows their aperture to wonder, to mercy, to the small acts of foolish kindness that sometimes save more than an algorithm can predict. If the reader seeks a clean moral, history offers none. The Iron Hands did not choose cruelty for its own sake. They chose survival in the only language they trusted after a cataclysm. They rebuilt, and in rebuilding they made decisions both effective and grievous. Their transformation is neither wholly condemnable nor wholly commendable. It is an ambivalent legacy, a sobering reminder that great loss begets great remedies, and that remedies can themselves harden into new forms of deprivation. As for me, Gas Havelock, I will keep recording. To chronicle is to insist that memory is not swallowed by expedience. I prefer to think that somewhere in the calculus, in the margins of a machine priest's log, or in the rust-gouged seam of a veteran's prosthetic, there remains a space for the old laughter Ferrus once shared. Perhaps those spaces are small, perhaps they will be rationed, but they are real and they matter. So I leave you with an image I could not set aside, a forge at dawn, a small pool of light catching on a silvered hand, a young marine, newly augmented, his eyes calibrated to see in smoky dawns, traces the scar along the Primarch's old hammer with a gloved fingertip. He does not understand all he touches. He does not need to. For a moment the machine and the man meet in that gesture, and the world feels less absolute. The iron hands press on, bearing themselves as both instrument and wound, and in that persistence is both the hope and the sorrow of their story.